The evening was alive with bright lights, shining chandeliers, and the soft sound of shoes clicking against the marble floor. The large conference hall had been decorated in a way that reflected wealth and power. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses filled the seats, their conversations buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Everyone had gathered for one reason: the arrival of the Saudi magnate. His name carried weight in business circles, and his reputation stretched across countries. People whispered about his fortune, his deals, and his influence. For many of the guests, just being in the same room with him felt like an opportunity that could change their careers. The air felt different when the doors opened. A hush fell over the crowd as the magnate stepped inside. He walked with confidence, his long robe flowing gracefully, his golden cufflinks glinting under the lights. Bodyguards moved quickly around him, clearing his path. The audience straightened in their seats, their eyes fixed on him. Some smiled too eagerly, hoping he would notice. Others tried to look calm, hiding the nervous excitement bubbling inside them. Everyone wanted to be remembered by him, even if it was just a nod or a glance. While all this was happening at the center of the hall, at the far end stood the janitor. Dressed in a simple uniform, he quietly swept the floor, picked up empty cups, and adjusted chairs that had been left out of place. No one paid attention to him. Guests walked past him as if he wasn't there. For them, he was invisible, part of the background, a man whose only job was to keep the place clean. But his eyes watched everything. He noticed how people bowed slightly as the magnate walked in. He noticed the sparkle of admiration mixed with fear on their faces. He had seen this before. Different place, different time, but the same kind of respect given to those with wealth. The magnate slowly made his way to the stage. Every step was deliberate, every gesture carried authority. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. His silence was enough to keep the room in awe. People leaned closer, whispering to each other about his past achievements, his investments, and the rumors about his power. When he finally reached the podium, the photographers rushed forward, their cameras flashing. The crowd clapped, though the clapping sounded more like duty than genuine excitement. The janitor, holding his broom, paused for a moment to watch. His face was calm, almost unreadable. For him, this was just another evening at work. But inside, he understood far more than anyone would ever guess. He had lived through struggles, learned languages, and carried knowledge that no one expected from a man in his position. As he leaned on his broom, he listened carefully, ready for what would unfold. The guests, however, were caught in a kind of spell. They adjusted their ties, smoothed their dresses, and sat up straight, as if their appearance alone would impress the magnate. The hall became silent, waiting for his words. In that silence, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted nervously, and the distant clink of glasses being cleared by servers. At that moment, the difference between the front of the room and the back of the room could not have been clearer. At the front stood the magnate, powerful, wealthy, and admired. At the back stood the janitor, unnoticed, unseen, and underestimated. No one could imagine that their worlds were about to collide. No one thought the man with the broom would play any role in what was to come. But fate had a way of turning ordinary moments into unforgettable ones, and the night was only just beginning. The atmosphere grew heavier as the magnate adjusted the microphone. All eyes were on him. Everyone held their breath. It was as if the entire room had forgotten itself, waiting only for his voice. The janitor quietly bent down to pick up a discarded napkin, but his ears were focused, sharp, ready. He understood the language that was about to be spoken. And unlike everyone else in that hall, he would not remain silent. The magnate adjusted the microphone, and a deep silence covered the entire hall. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind where every shuffle of paper or cough could be heard. Guests leaned forward in their seats, waiting for him to speak. And then, without hesitation, he began to speak in Arabic. The language rolled off his tongue smoothly, rich with confidence. His words were fast yet clear, carrying the rhythm of someone who had grown up mastering every sound. For him, speaking Arabic in this gathering was not just communication, it was a display of pride, culture, and power. To many in the room, it was almost like music, beautiful yet completely unknown. A few nodded as if they understood, though they didn't. Most simply stared, trying not to look lost. The magnate's voice filled the hall. He spoke about leadership, tradition, and strength. But hidden within his words was something else, an undertone of arrogance. He knew most of the audience couldn't understand a single sentence. He knew his language gave him an edge, separating him from everyone else. He relished that distance. To him it was proof of superiority. He could say anything and they would still clap. Around the room reactions varied. Some guests smiled politely, their expressions rehearsed, pretending to catch meaning where there was none. Others nodded at random, hoping to appear intelligent. A few quietly tapped notes into their phones, planning to later ask someone what had been said. But none dared to interrupt, none dared to admit they were lost. Status and pride held their tongues still. At the side of the hall, waiters carried trays of drinks, stepping carefully so their footsteps wouldn't break the heavy atmosphere. Even the clinking of glasses seemed too loud. The janitor paused his work for a moment, standing by the wall with his broom resting lightly on his shoulder. His eyes followed the magnate, but unlike the others, he understood every single word. He listened carefully, his mind translating instantly, his face showing no reaction. The magnate raised his chin slightly as he continued. He told stories of his business victories, of deals won and challenges crushed. He sprinkled his speech with phrases meant to intimidate, clever lines that carried double meanings. He spoke as though daring someone to answer him. But no one moved. The audience remained still, silent, obedient. And then came the remark that changed everything. With a sly smile, he shifted his words toward the workers in the hall. He spoke of people who clean floors, carry trays, or serve others. He used words that cut deep, words that described them as small, as unimportant, as shadows that pass unnoticed. His laughter, quiet but sharp, echoed for a moment before he continued. The executives chuckled nervously, unsure if they should laugh with him or stay quiet. But at the back of the hall, the janitor's grip tightened around his broom. He had heard insults before in life many times, but hearing them now, spoken in a language no one else understood, was different. It was not just arrogance, it was cruelty hidden in plain sight. The magnate thought no one would ever catch him. The janitor lowered his broom and stood a little taller. His heart beat faster, but not with fear, with certainty. He knew what he had to do. Around him no one noticed. They were too caught up in the magnate's performance, too eager to please, too blind to see what was happening. The magnate's speech grew louder, his voice booming through the hall. He was enjoying the moment, convinced that he had absolute control over the room. He leaned slightly forward, speaking more directly now, almost mocking, as if daring someone, anyone, to challenge him. The janitor inhaled deeply. He waited. He measured the right moment. And while the rest of the hall sat in silence, pretending to understand, pretending to admire, one man in the shadows prepared to break it. He was not dressed in a suit, he did not wear a watch worth thousands, and no one had ever looked at him as important. But he carried something greater than wealth, knowledge, confidence, and the courage to speak. That moment was approaching, the moment when silence would break, and the magnate would finally realize that his words had not gone unnoticed. The room thought they were watching a performance of power. What they didn't know was that a far greater performance was about to begin. The magnate's words echoed through the vast hall, flowing like a current that only he could control. The Arabic syllables rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed rehearsed, practiced to perfection. To him it was a performance, a display of elegance and dominance. To the audience, however, it was something entirely different. Rows of men and women in polished suits sat still, their hands folded neatly in their laps, their eyes fixed on the speaker. Many of them did not understand a single word. Some had studied enough Arabic to recognize greetings, polite phrases, maybe even a handful of business terms. But this was far beyond their grasp. Yet none of them dared to admit their confusion. Politeness held their faces steady. Pride forced them to nod along. One man in the front row tilted his head slightly, pretending to catch every meaning. A woman further back scribbled notes on a pad, filling the page with meaningless lines so no one would guess her ignorance. They were all trapped in the same silent agreement. No one would break the illusion. To do so might risk embarrassment or worse, insult the magnate himself. The silence became heavy, almost suffocating. Not the silence of peace but of pretense. The magnate could feel it too. He noticed the blank stares, the shallow nods, and it fed his confidence. He believed his power over the room was complete. He smiled faintly, satisfied with the thought that no one dared challenge him, not even with a question. In the middle rows, a few whispered softly to one another. "Do you know what he said?" someone asked under their breath. "Not a word," came the reply, followed by nervous laughter quickly hushed. Their eyes darted back to the stage, fearful that the magnate might have seen. Phones buzzed silently in pockets, but no one reached to check. It would look disrespectful. Better to sit, to nod, to act as if every word was being absorbed. Meanwhile, waiters carrying trays of glasses moved as quietly as shadows. They glided along the edges of the hall, careful not to disturb the false stillness. One server stumbled slightly when a guest brushed against his tray, and the soft clink of glass drew sharp glances. In that quiet, even the smallest sound felt too loud. At the very back of the room, the janitor leaned on his broom, watching. His posture was casual, but his mind was sharp. Every phrase, every tone, every hidden insult in the magnate's speech reached him clearly. Unlike the audience, he did not nod out of fear or pretense. He listened with a straight face, knowing the magnate believed his words were untouchable. The janitor's eyes moved across the hall, observing the performance not only on stage but also in the seats. He saw the nervous tapping of a foot, the clenched jaw of a man trying to appear wise, the fake smiles plastered across faces hungry for approval. It struck him how powerful silence could be, not the silence of respect but the silence of weakness. The silence of people too afraid to reveal the truth. The magnate paused briefly, letting his words settle like dust in the air. He looked around the room, enjoying the sight of dozens of people hanging on his every word. He mistook their silence for awe. In his mind he was the teacher, the leader, the voice of authority. He believed no one had the courage or the knowledge to interrupt. But the janitor knew better. The silence was not awe, it was ignorance wrapped in politeness. And ignorance had a way of breaking apart when the truth was finally spoken aloud. The magnate chuckled to himself, tossing in another phrase layered with arrogance. The audience forced another round of polite smiles, their silence even more painful than before. The hall, despite being filled with people, felt almost empty, as if every voice had been locked away. Yet somewhere in that emptiness something was building. The janitor's heart beat steadily, his mind translating each insult and boast. He stood there, invisible to everyone else, carrying a voice no one expected. The silence of the audience was a mask, but it would not last forever. One man at the back of the hall was about to change everything. The janitor moved quietly through the wide hall, his broom brushing softly against the polished marble floor. He bent down to pick up a napkin someone had carelessly dropped, straightened a chair left askew, and carried on as though he were invisible. And in truth, to most of the guests he was. Their eyes passed over him as if he were part of the furniture, part of the background that kept their world neat but never deserved attention. He had long grown used to this invisibility. Years of working behind the scenes had taught him that people rarely noticed those who cleaned after them. They noticed the shine on the tables, the spotless glasses, the polished floor, but never the hands that made them so. Tonight was no different. As the magnate commanded the stage, the janitor faded into the shadows, his uniform blending with the walls, his presence ignored. But within him lay a story no one in the room could guess. He had once lived far away in countries where Arabic was not just a language of business but of daily life. He had learned it not from books or classrooms but from markets, conversations, and friendships. He had carried those words with him across years, like treasures no one else could see. To others he was a man with a broom. To himself he was much more. Someone who understood cultures, languages, and struggles that the wealthy in the room had never known. He watched the magnate's performance with careful eyes. Every gesture, every boast, every hidden insult wrapped in elegant Arabic, he caught it all. Where the audience heard nothing but sounds they couldn't grasp, the janitor heard sharpness, mockery, even cruelty. The magnate's words were not simply about pride and culture. They carried disdain for those he believed were beneath him. The janitor's jaw tightened, but he showed nothing. He swept another corner, his movements steady, patient. Around him, the guests continued to ignore him. They whispered to one another about business deals, about the magnate's power, about the importance of networking. Some glanced at their watches, wondering when the speech would end. None of them saw the janitor's calm gaze. None of them noticed how still he stood when the magnate's words grew harsher. The irony was heavy. Here was a man in expensive robes, standing tall under the lights, believing he was untouchable. And here was another man in worn shoes and a faded uniform, holding a broom, who actually understood every word. The power in that room was not where anyone thought it was. The janitor shifted slightly, leaning on his broom, pretending to rest. Inside, though, his thoughts were alive. He remembered the long evenings in a foreign country, sitting with friends as they taught him phrases, correcting his pronunciation until he spoke like one of them. He remembered reading newspapers in Arabic, struggling at first, then slowly mastering each word. He remembered laughter, mistakes, and the pride he felt when he realized he had truly learned a second tongue. That hidden part of his life now burned inside him like a secret flame. The magnate's speech grew bolder. He spoke of wealth, of strength, of people knowing their place. He mentioned workers, the ones who cleaned, who carried, who served, and his tone sharpened, mocking. The audience chuckled lightly, trying to follow, though they didn't understand. The janitor's eyes narrowed. Those words, meant to be hidden in a language unknown to most, had reached him clearly. He knew the insult wasn't directed at him personally, but it felt personal. It felt like every man and woman who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated was being spoken down to at that moment. The janitor gripped the broom tighter. He felt the weight of choice pressing on him. He could stay silent as he had so many times before, let the evening pass and remain invisible. Or he could speak, knowing that one word, one sentence could shift the balance of the room. He glanced around, watching the guests nod blindly, their silence feeding the magnate's pride. His heart beat harder. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and plain, then back up at the grand stage where the magnate stood glowing under the spotlight. The difference between them seemed endless, but the janitor knew something that bridged that gap. He carried knowledge, and with it came power, not the kind that money could buy, but the kind that could silence arrogance. For now he waited. He kept sweeping, kept moving silently through the hall, knowing the moment had not yet come. The magnate believed he had full control, but the janitor knew the truth. Power, when built on arrogance, always cracked. And when that crack appeared, he would be ready to step through it, not as a servant, but as a voice that could not be ignored. The magnate's voice rose, his tone sharp now, filled with pride that bordered on arrogance. He spoke of strength, success, and leadership. Then his words shifted, turning toward the people he thought of as lesser. The workers, the servers, the cleaners. His language, though elegant, carried mockery. He laughed softly as he spoke of those who swept floors and stood in corners like shadows. The audience, clueless to the meaning, gave polite smiles, some even laughing along, not knowing they were laughing at themselves and at the very people standing quietly in the hall. But one man understood. At the far edge of the room, the janitor froze mid-step. His broom rested against the wall, his back straightened, and his chest rose with a deep breath. Every insult spoken in Arabic had landed like a stone on his heart. He was not just listening now, he was deciding. His eyes, calm until now, carried a fire. He looked at the magnate on stage, at the audience pretending to understand, and something inside him shifted. He had remained silent his whole life in rooms like this. Tonight he would not. The magnate, amused by his own words, leaned back slightly, scanning the crowd with a smirk. His gaze swept across the rows of executives and investors, never once drifting to the janitor in the shadows. Why would it? To him, a janitor was invisible, a man beneath notice. But that assumption was about to be shattered. The room remained trapped in silence, silence of pretense, silence of fear. And then, cutting through that silence like a blade, came a voice. It was not loud at first, but it was clear, firm, confident. The kind of voice that demanded attention without needing to shout. The janitor had spoken. In flawless Arabic. Heads whipped around. Glasses nearly slipped from hands. The waiters froze mid-step. The audience's eyes widened in disbelief as they tried to process what they had just heard. A janitor, this janitor, had replied to the magnate in the very language no one else could grasp. Not broken words, not stammering phrases, but a response as sharp and smooth as the magnate's own speech. The magnate's smile faltered. For a brief moment he thought perhaps he had misheard. But then the janitor spoke again, louder this time, his voice steady as stone. He directly addressed the magnate's remarks, dismantling the insults one by one, weaving respect and dignity into every sentence. His words were not angry, they carried calm strength. He did not insult in return. He did not shout. Instead he revealed understanding, and with it, authority. Gasps rippled through the hall. The executives who had been nodding without comprehension now turned in shock, whispering frantically to one another. What did he say? What's happening? But the ones who didn't know Arabic could only sense the shift in power. They could feel the weight of the moment in the magnate's stiffened posture and the janitor's unwavering tone. The janitor stepped forward, no longer hiding in the back. He didn't need a stage or lights or a microphone. His words filled the room just as strongly as the magnate's had moments before. Every eye followed him now. The man who had been invisible was suddenly the center of everything. The magnate blinked, struggling to maintain his composure. His authority had never been challenged like this, not by an equal and certainly not by someone he considered beneath him. He searched for a response, but the janitor's flawless Arabic had stolen his certainty. For the first time that evening he did not look untouchable. The audience sat frozen, caught between confusion and awe. They did not understand the words, but they understood the silence that followed. A silence not of ignorance this time, but of shock. The magnate had spoken as if no one could answer. Now someone had. Someone he least expected. The janitor's voice grew firmer, each sentence carving through the room. He wasn't just replying, he was teaching. He was reminding the magnate and everyone else that dignity had no uniform, no title, no price tag. His reply was not just about words. It was about presence. It was about being seen. The broom that once made him invisible now stood like a symbol at his side. And the magnate, for the first time, had no choice but to listen. The janitor's words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. For a moment no one moved, no one even breathed. The room, once buzzing with whispers and shallow laughter, had turned into a place of absolute stillness. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, heavy and unshakable, as if the walls themselves were listening. Every pair of eyes in the hall turned toward the janitor. Executives who had barely noticed him minutes ago now stared as if seeing him for the very first time. Their faces were painted with disbelief. How could this man, who had been sweeping floors, suddenly speak with the voice of authority? Even the waiters, balancing trays of glasses, froze in place. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The magnate, standing tall under the lights, blinked in disbelief. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled slightly at his sides, but for the first time his voice failed him. He had built his power on certainty. Certainty that no one would dare answer, that his words would hang above everyone like a crown. But now that crown had been knocked askew by someone he had dismissed as a shadow. The janitor's tone was calm, not loud, but it carried further than shouting ever could. He wasn't angry, he was composed, his words precise and deliberate. He spoke not as a servant daring to interrupt, but as an equal. Someone who understood the language, the culture, and the pride behind it. Every phrase he uttered struck like a hammer, cracking the silence and replacing it with truth. The audience felt it. Even those who did not understand Arabic could feel the balance shifting. They saw the magnate's composure falter, saw the quiet dignity in the janitor's stance. A murmur rippled through the crowd, whispers of confusion and awe. What did he say? How does he know? Who is this man? But those whispers died quickly, swallowed by the gravity of the moment. For the first time that evening, the magnate looked uncertain. His lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came. His eyes flickered from the janitor to the audience, searching for support, for the admiration that had fueled his arrogance. But the room was no longer his. The silence was no longer in his favor. The janitor stepped forward slowly, broom still in hand, his presence growing stronger with each word. He did not bow, did not avert his eyes. He looked straight at the magnate, holding his ground in a way that few ever dared. And in that gaze there was no fear, only quiet strength. The silence deepened, not out of confusion now but out of respect. The audience realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, the moment when power shifted from the stage to the floor. The man who had been invisible was now commanding every soul in the room. A single cough broke the stillness, then nothing again. The magnate swallowed, but the sound of his throat clearing only made the silence louder. For the first time in his life he was the one standing powerless in a crowd. The janitor finished his reply with dignity, his final words echoing softly. He did not shout for applause, did not demand recognition. He simply let his truth linger in the air, knowing it needed no decoration. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with respect, filled with the weight of a moment that no one present would ever forget. Every guest, every server, every guard felt it deep inside. The janitor had not just spoken Arabic, he had spoken courage. And courage has a way of silencing even the loudest voices. The silence did not last forever. It broke, not with chatter or nervous laughter, but with something deeper, a slow ripple of realization spreading across the hall. People began to sit differently, their postures changing as they absorbed what had just happened. The man they had dismissed as background, a figure meant to clean up after them, had just commanded the entire room without a microphone, without wealth, without title. It began with a single pair of hands clapping. The sound echoed sharply, almost awkward at first, but it carried a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. Then another joined, and another, until the applause swelled like a wave rising higher and higher. The hall that had been frozen in silence erupted into thunderous respect, not for the magnate, but for the janitor who had stood tall when no one else dared. Executives who had been nodding blindly during the magnate's speech now turned their admiration to the janitor. Some leaned forward, whispering his name if they knew it, others asking frantically, "Who is he? Where did he learn?" But no answer mattered now. The truth was already plain before them. Dignity, knowledge, and courage could not be hidden, no matter what uniform a man wore. The magnate stood stiffly, his lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes betrayed something he had never shown in public before: hesitation. He glanced toward the janitor, his pride clashing with the undeniable fact that the room had shifted. For years, he had walked into places expecting respect handed to him freely. Tonight, it had been taken from him, piece by a man holding a broom. The janitor did not bow or boast. He simply stood in the same plain clothes he had walked in with, his hands steady at his sides. He let the applause wash over him, not as a performance but as acknowledgement. When he finally spoke again, his words were softer, but they carried the same weight as before. He spoke of humility, of the value of every person in a room no matter their role. He reminded them that true respect is not demanded, it is earned through action, through character, through humanity. The audience listened with rapt attention. For the first time that evening, they were hearing not a performance but a truth that resonated with every soul. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had ignored him minutes earlier. Others nodded, their faces bright with admiration. Even the servers standing along the wall straightened with pride, as if his words gave voice to their own silent struggles. When the janitor finished, there was no arrogance in his tone, no hunger for applause. He simply stepped back, his broom still leaning nearby, as though to remind everyone that he had not changed his role. He had simply revealed who he truly was. The applause grew louder, some even standing to honor him. And in that moment, the magnate did something no one expected. Slowly, deliberately, he inclined his head toward the janitor. It was not a bow, not an open surrender, but it was acknowledgement, a small gesture of respect he had never given lightly. The audience caught it instantly. It was proof that even the powerful could be humbled, and that the man they had overlooked had forced that humility with nothing but words and truth. The janitor had not only silenced the magnate, he had transformed the room. In that hall of wealth and power, the richest man was no longer the one in gold. It was the one who had spoken with dignity and courage, reminding them all that humanity does not wear labels. Respect, once thought to belong only to the elite, now belonged to the man who had earned it. The broom in the corner was no longer just a tool. Tonight, it stood as a symbol, a reminder that strength can rise from anywhere, that silence can be broken by the most unexpected voice, and that respect is not about position but about truth. The applause eventually faded, but the energy it left behind lingered in the hall like a powerful echo. People shifted in their seats, still replaying the scene in their minds, the janitor standing tall, his voice steady, and the magnate silenced in front of his own audience. It was the kind of moment that etched itself permanently into memory, the kind people would retell again and again in different versions, each one carrying the same truth. The magnate, once untouchable, stood still on the stage. His confidence, though bruised, had not fully broken. He was too proud a man to show defeat, yet deep in his eyes was the unmistakable shadow of humility. He had been reminded, by someone he had not even considered worthy of acknowledgement, that power without respect was fragile. In that quiet understanding, he gave the janitor a final look, not of anger, but of recognition. It was subtle, but it carried meaning. The janitor did not gloat. He did not bask in victory. He simply returned to his place, broom in hand, as though he were resuming his duty. But nothing about him was the same anymore, at least not in the eyes of the people around him. The man who had once been invisible was now unforgettable. Every guest in that hall would remember his face, his voice, his courage. For the servers, the security guards, and the workers at the edges of the room, the moment was deeply personal. They straightened their backs, their steps lighter, their hearts swelling with quiet pride. Someone who looked like them, someone treated like them, had spoken truth to power and turned the room in his favor. It felt like a victory not just for him, but for every person who had ever been overlooked. The executives, too, left with a lesson written across their faces. Many of them had walked into the hall thinking only of opportunities, of deals, of impressing the magnate. They had measured worth by money, clothing, and titles. But tonight had cracked that illusion. They had witnessed a reversal of roles so profound that it could not be denied. Respect had shifted from the stage to the floor. The richest man in the room had been silenced by the wisdom of the poorest. As the guests began to leave, whispers filled the air. Some spoke of the janitor in awe, some in shame for having dismissed him, and some in admiration of his knowledge. The story spread before the night was even over, moving from one circle to another, until the entire gathering was buzzing not about the magnate's speech but about the janitor's courage. The magnate left surrounded by his guards, but there was no celebration in his steps. He walked out a quieter man than he had entered, carrying with him the sharp memory of a challenge he had not expected. For him, the evening had become a reminder that no matter how high one stands, respect must be earned, not forced. The janitor, meanwhile, stayed behind after the applause, quietly resuming his work. He swept the floor, collected discarded cups, and straightened the chairs once again. Yet the room no longer saw him as just a janitor. To those who remained, every movement he made seemed different, touched with dignity. The broom was no longer a sign of lowliness but a symbol of hidden strength. That night left the hall transformed. And long after the lights were turned off, long after the guests had gone home, the lesson remained. It lived in the minds of those who had been there and grew stronger every time the story was retold. The lasting truth was clear. Respect is not commanded by wealth or demanded by position. It cannot be bought and it cannot be faked. True respect comes from knowledge, character, and the courage to speak when silence is easier. The Saudi magnate had walked in expecting admiration. But it was the janitor, quiet, overlooked, and underestimated, who walked away with honor. And from that night on, the story of the janitor who silenced a magnate with nothing but his words became more than just an event. It became a lesson, a reminder passed down, a tale that proved greatness is not always found in those who stand tallest, but often in those the world refuses to see, until they choose to speak. The story did not end the moment the hall emptied. In fact, its true weight began after the applause faded and people stepped back into their cars, their offices, and their lives. What had happened that night could not be contained within the walls of the grand conference hall. It began to travel, quietly at first, then louder, like a spark that refuses to die out. By the next morning, executives who had been present were already speaking of it in hushed tones over breakfast meetings. "Did you see the janitor?" one asked. "I've never heard Arabic spoken like that," another replied. Their words carried awe but also guilt, for they realized how easily they had ignored the man until he revealed himself. The story spread among staff members too. Workers whispered about it in hallways and cafeterias, proud that someone from their side had shown such courage. It became more than an incident, it became a tale of dignity. The magnate, despite his pride, could not stop the ripples. His aides tried to dismiss the event as a misunderstanding, but they too had seen his silence on stage and no denial could erase it. His rivals in business circles began to retell the story with a smile, not to mock him openly but to remind others that even the mighty can stumble. Each time the tale was shared, the janitor's stature grew taller. For the janitor himself, life outwardly looked the same. He still came to work in his plain uniform, still carried his broom, still performed his duties with care. Yet nothing around him felt the same anymore. Colleagues greeted him differently, no longer with a quick nod but with genuine respect. Guests who once brushed past him now looked twice, curious, even cautious. He had not asked for recognition but it followed him everywhere. Late at night, when the hall was empty, he reflected on what had happened. He did not see himself as a hero, nor did he carry bitterness for being ignored for so long. In his heart, he believed what he had always believed, that dignity is not measured by wealth and courage often comes when it is least expected. Still, he wondered why fate had chosen that moment, in that room with that audience to test him. Meanwhile, the story began to leave the city. A journalist who had attended the gathering wrote an article, describing the night a janitor silenced a magnate. It was picked up by smaller outlets than larger ones. Social media buzzed with posts, some calling it an inspiration, others debating its meaning. Clips from the event, taken by guests who had filmed parts of the speech, circulated online. Though not everyone could understand the Arabic exchange, the shift in energy was clear even in the video. The magnate's confidence shrinking, the janitor's calm reply holding the room. Strangers across the world reacted. Some saw it as a story about equality, others about humility. Teachers told it in classrooms, parents shared it with their children, and workers repeated it as proof that no one is truly invisible. The janitor's name, once unknown, became a symbol. And the magnate? He carried on with his empire, but something inside him had shifted. Those who knew him well said he had grown quieter, less boastful in private. He had learned, perhaps for the first time in his life, that respect cannot be demanded simply by standing taller than others. Respect comes when one recognizes the humanity in those around them. The janitor had taught him that lesson without ever intending to. The lasting impact of that night was not in who won or lost, but in how it reminded people that true strength comes from knowledge, humility, and the courage to break silence. Long after the event, whenever the janitor entered the hall with his broom, people would stop, look, and remember. They no longer saw him as part of the background. They saw him as a man who once made an entire room fall silent. Not with wealth, not with status, but with truth. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night refused to fade. What had begun as whispers in one hall had grown into a story repeated in offices, schools, and gatherings far beyond the city. The tale of the janitor who silenced a magnate traveled across borders, told in boardrooms and break rooms alike. Some called it a parable, others a reminder, but everyone agreed it carried a lesson that was difficult to ignore. The janitor himself tried to keep living quietly as he always had. He woke each morning, wore the same uniform, and carried his broom to work. Yet everywhere he went, eyes followed him. Colleagues who once walked past without acknowledgement now stopped to greet him warmly. Guests who once ignored him now offered polite smiles. Some even asked him questions, not about cleaning but about life, about his thoughts. He had not sought attention, but attention had found him, and it weighed heavily on his shoulders. There were those who wanted to use him too. Activists reached out, asking him to speak at rallies about workers' rights. Journalists begged for interviews. A few companies even offered him jobs, not because of his cleaning skills, but because of his reputation. He listened politely to all of them, but inside he wondered, was this really his purpose? He had never wanted fame. He had only spoken because it was right. Meanwhile, the magnate's life took a different turn. Though his empire still stood strong, his image had cracked. Business partners questioned his arrogance, competitors whispered about his humiliation, and even admirers began to see him differently. He too could not escape the story. No matter where he traveled, someone would bring it up, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a warning. For the first time in decades, he realized that his words had consequences he could not control. One evening, the janitor and the magnate crossed paths again, not in a hall filled with cameras, but in a quiet corridor, away from the spotlight. The magnate, without his entourage, seemed smaller, more human. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then, in a low voice, the magnate spoke, not in English but in Arabic. It was not a boast, not an insult, but a simple sentence of respect. The janitor nodded, answering in the same language, his voice calm. They did not argue, nor did they pretend to be friends. But in that brief exchange, something shifted. The magnate had learned humility, the janitor had taught it without trying. As months turned into years, the story only grew. Children learned it as a lesson in schools, speakers used it in lectures about dignity, and workers carried it as a badge of pride. The janitor never sought to be a symbol, yet he became one, living proof that knowledge and courage could shatter the strongest illusions of power. And so, the man once overlooked remained at his post, broom in hand, but never invisible again. He became more than a worker. He became a reminder. Every person who entered that hall, whether a billionaire or a clerk, would glance at him and remember the night silence fell, and truth rose. The magnate, too, changed in small but noticeable ways. He no longer mocked the unseen. He no longer believed language could shield arrogance. Though pride remained in him, it was tempered now by the knowledge that anyone, anywhere, could rise and answer him. In the end, the legacy of that night was larger than either of them. It was not about a janitor or a magnate. It was about the timeless truth that respect belongs not to wealth, not to status, but to those who live with dignity. And long after the applause ended, long after the crowd dispersed, that truth continued to travel, like a flame passed from one candle to another, lighting hearts wherever the story was told.